Simi! Simi! Simi!
Remove him from this floor. Security! Get him out of here! He doesn't belong anywhere near my daughter.
Mr. Adebayo, please, sir. I don't care about the money. Just let me hold her hand for a minute. Please, sir. I love Simi so much. I will never hurt her intentionally. Please, sir. Take it. Let me fly in one of the best doctors in the country to take care of her. Please, just let me help her.
You think your money can fix this? Do you really think that your money can fix this? Look at me. What happened here cannot be repaired. No amount of money will ever change what you did.
Our story begins in the cold, towering heart of Chicago, where Julian Vance grew up. To the rest of the world, Julian had everything. Raised in old European wealth, he lived in a 64th-floor penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, drove cars that cost more than suburban houses, and had his name etched onto skyscraper foundations before he turned 30. But inside the walls of the Vance empire, Julian was not a man. He was an asset. His mother, Victoria Vance, was a cold, aristocratic matriarch who represented centuries of old British-American money. Since her husband's death 10 years prior, Victoria had raised Julian not with affection, but like a corporate portfolio. His childhood wasn't measured in bedtime stories or birthday parties. It was measured in private European tutoring, polo matches, etiquette coaches, and wealth management. On a bitter Thursday evening in late November, the temperature in Chicago had dropped to single digits. Inside the private dining room of the Grand Lux, Victoria sat across from Julian, slicing her filet mignon with mathematical precision. Sitting beside her was Clara Montgomery, a cold, striking blonde tech heiress whose father controlled the largest fiber-optic network in North America. Clara was chosen by Victoria to be Julian's fiancée, a woman who viewed marriage not as love, but as a multi-million-dollar tax-neutral consolidation. Victoria announced casually that the press release was going out on Monday. The Montgomery family had agreed to a 30% equity swap upon Julian's marriage to Clara, with the ceremony set for Cap Del in June. Julian's fork hovered over his plate. He reminded his mother that he and Clara had spoken 3 times in their entire lives and didn't even like each other. Clara didn't even look up from her phone as she told him not to be dramatic, calling it practical. Her father wanted the shipping routes, his mother wanted her father's tech stack. They would live on separate floors of the estate. Something flickered behind her eyes before she buried it again, adding that neither of them got to choose differently, so they might as well pick the version with better real estate. Julian repeated the word practical under his breath. The word echoed inside his head, louder and sharper with every tick of the dining room clock. The air in the private suite suddenly felt thick, heavy, like wet cement filling his lungs. His collar choked him. His tie felt like a velvet noose tightening around his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, launching into a violent, acute panic attack brought on by 30 years of emotional starvation and suffocating control. Julian's vision blurred at the edges. He needed air, cold, real air. He stood up so fast, his mahogany chair clattered backward against the hardwood floor. Victoria snapped instantly, her voice dropping an octave into a razor-sharp warning, telling him he was making an absolute scene before the waitstaff. Julian didn't answer. He couldn't. He pressed a hand to his chest, trembling violently as he stumbled past the table. Ignoring his mother's sharp demands and Clara's cold, unbothered gaze, he headed blindly down the hallway toward the restrooms. But halfway there, the walls seemed to close in on him. Bypassing the exit to the main hall, Julian pushed past a startled waiter and shoved open the heavy brass service door, bursting out into the freezing Chicago night. The sudden drop in temperature hit him like a physical blow, but it didn't slow his racing pulse. Desperate to reach the safety of his sedan parked around the corner, Julian tried to jog down the dimly lit service alleyway. His vision tunneled, his knees turned to water. 3 steps into the alley, his strength completely gave out. Julian's foot caught on the curb, and he went down hard. He hit the icy pavement, scraping his palms and sliding down a damp brick wall into a pile of wet cardboard boxes. The icy rain pounded down on his $3,000 wool coat, but Julian couldn't feel the cold. He lay there, on his side in the mud, gasping desperately for oxygen, clutching his chest as dark specks swirled across his eyes. He thought his heart was stopping. He thought he was dying alone in an alley full of trash, less than 50 feet away from a mother who only cared about a corporate merger. Then, through the roar of the wind, he heard footsteps. Fast, decisive footsteps, splashing through the rain puddles. Simi was 24 years old and running on 2 hours of sleep. A brilliant Yoruba woman with dark skin and braided hair tucking into her collar, she was working extra shifts as a resident nurse at the West Side Community Clinic to pay off her mountain of medical school loans. Her feet were aching inside her worn sneakers, her faded green scrubs were stained with iodine, and her backpack was stuffed with heavy pediatric cardiology textbooks. She was exhausted, cold, and desperately wanted to get home. But the moment she saw the young white man collapsed in the alleyway, every instinct as a medical professional kicked into overdrive. Dropping to her knees directly in the mud beside him, Simi commanded him to look into her eyes. Her voice wasn't gentle, but it was incredibly steady, an anchor in the middle of his storm. She reached out, grabbing Julian's face with both hands. Her warm, dark hands were cold from the rain, but her palms were firm and real against his pale cheeks. She told him he was having a panic attack. His heart was fine. He was not dying. She instructed him to breathe with her, counting in his head. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold it, then let it out slow. Julian stared at her. Through the rain falling across her skin and the tight braids sticking to her forehead, he saw total, unadulterated focus. She didn't look at his luxury watch or the designer label on his coat. She just saw a human being who was slipping under the waves. For 5 agonizing minutes, Simi knelt in the freezing mud, holding his face, guiding his lungs back to life until the terror receded and Julian's chest settled into a steady rhythm. Simi let out a long sigh of relief, wiping the rain from her forehead. She looked at his thin, tailored European suit and shook her head with a weary smile, grumbling that if he was going to have a nervous breakdown in Chicago in November, he should really wear a parka, because that suit wasn't going to keep him out of the morgue. Julian leaned against the brick wall, still breathless, apologizing to her. Simi told him not to apologize for breathing, pulling out a warm thermal flask from her backpack. She poured steaming lemon ginger tea into the cap and shoved it into his trembling hands, telling him there was a 24-hour diner at the end of the block and that he was coming with her until his hands stopped shaking. They walked into the Maple Street Diner, a warm, cozy spot that smelled of toasted rye, cheap coffee, and floor wax. Sitting across from Simi in a cracked vinyl booth, Julian drank the hot tea while Simi unpacked her textbooks, spreading highlighted notes across the laminate table. Propping her chin on her hand, Simi asked if he was going to tell her his name or if she had to keep calling him the guy who almost died in her alley. Julian stammered his first name, feeling strangely exposed, before giving a fake last name, Julian Vale. It was his father's middle name, close enough to feel true, far enough to feel safe. He added that whatever she was picturing back in that alley wasn't a person, but his mother and his job. Simi nodded slowly, her expression softening. She mentioned that Family Pressure was a familiar song. Her dad, Babatunde, was a traditional Yoruba man who moved to Chicago 30 years ago from Lagos with $50 in his shoe. If she got an A- on a cardiology exam, he would ask what happened to the other 5%. She laughed, a warm, rich sound that seemed to heat up the entire booth, adding that at least she knew he did it because he worked his fingers to the bone so she wouldn't have to clean office buildings like he did. Simi's mother, Titilayo Adebayo, was the heart of their household, a deeply faithful, loving Yoruba woman who made the best jollof rice in Illinois and prayed over Simi's medical textbooks before every major exam. Julian looked down at his tea, contrasting Simi's loving family with his own cold reality, saying his mother pushed him because if he wasn't perfect, the market cap dropped. Simi paused, her smile fading as she looked at the profound, quiet sadness in Julian's eyes. She reached across the table and gently touched the back of his hand, softly telling him that in this diner, nobody cared about his market cap, and that making it through the night was a win. That night was the beginning of the lie. Julian knew he should have told her right then. He should have said he was Julian Vance, heir to $12 billion. But he saw the way this brilliant woman looked at him, without ambition, without expectation, without the calculating glaze he had seen in every high society girl his mother had ever introduced him to. To Simi, he was just Julian, a quiet, stressed-out guy who needed a hot cup of tea. And Julian was so desperate to be loved for who he was, not what he owned, that he stayed silent. Over the next 6 months, Julian Vance built a completely separate life across 2 worlds. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, after finishing 12-hour corporate strategy sessions at Vance Tower, Julian would change out of his designer suits in the back of an alleyway. He bought cheap denim jackets, faded flannel shirts, and second-hand boots. He parked his car 2 miles away and rode the subway lines, sitting amidst the noise and grease, just to meet Simi at the diner when her hospital shifts ended at 11 p.m. They spent hours in that booth. Julian learned everything about her, her dream of opening a free pediatric clinic on the south side of Chicago, her father's strict cultural expectations, and her mother's warm prayers. In return, Julian opened his soul in ways he had never dared. He told her about the suffocating silence of his estate, the crushing weight of his father's death, and how he felt like an actor playing a role in a life he never chose. Simi whispered to him one snowy midnight in Millennium Park that he wasn't an actor. He was a good man who just needed to stop letting other people write his script. Julian pulled her close, burying his face in her scarf, smelling the sweet scent of cocoa butter and rain on her skin. He loved her with an intensity that terrified him, but every single day, the guilt of his deception grew heavier. Meanwhile, in the high society world Julian was neglecting, Victoria Vance was quietly tracking her son's movements through private investigators. The Montgomery announcement was 3 weeks from press, the shareholder vote already scheduled, and when the reports confirmed Julian was spending his nights with a working-class nurse, Victoria decided she had exactly one window left to end it quietly. One rainy afternoon, an immaculate black town car pulled up outside the West Side Community Clinic just as Simi was finishing her shift. A sharply dressed man in a tailored grey suit approached Simi, holding open the rear door, informing her that a client wished to have a brief word regarding her future. Perplexed, Simi stepped inside the luxurious leather interior. Sitting across from her was Victoria Vance, her face concealed partially in the shadows of tinted glass. Victoria looked Simi up and down, taking in her faded scrubs and worn sneakers with cold condescension, noting how exhausting it must be to work 80 hours a week carrying medical school debt while dreaming of an unaffordable pediatric clinic. Simi narrowed her eyes, asking who she was and how she knew her name. Victoria called that information irrelevant, pulling a sleek leather checkbook from her handbag and writing out a cashier's check for $500,000. She slid it across the armrest, smoothly explaining that it was enough to clear her medical loans and seed her clinic, provided she walked away from Julian, relocated her residency, and cut all contact. Simi stared at the check, then raised her eyes to meet Victoria's icy glare, realizing this was Julian's mother. Victoria's expression didn't change, warning Simi that Julian belonged to a world she couldn't comprehend, and urging her not to force a disruption to her family's standing in the city. A cold rage bloomed inside Simi's chest. She picked up the check, held it directly in front of Victoria's face, and slowly tore it straight down the middle, dropping the pieces onto Victoria's lap. Simi declared with righteous pride that her parents raised her with honor, and while they might not have millions, they didn't buy or sell human beings. Whoever her son was, he deserved someone who saw him as a man, not a transaction. Simi yanked open the car door and stepped out into the pouring rain, slamming it behind her. At the time, Simi assumed Julian's family was simply upper middle class and controlling. She had no idea the full, staggering scale of the empire behind that check. But the encounter left a dark cloud of suspicion over her heart. The dream ended completely on a wet Tuesday afternoon in April. Julian had rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood under an assumed name, a place where he and Simi could cook dinner together without high society intrusion. Simi had arrived early, using her spare key. She was beaming. She had just passed her board certification exam in pediatric trauma and wanted to surprise Julian with a home-cooked meal of pounded yam and egusi soup. While looking for a notepad in Julian's messenger bag, her fingers caught on a thick document sealed in a gold-embossed folder. Beside it lay an unreleased copy of Meridian Business Weekly. Simi pulled it out. On the cover was a sharp photograph of Julian in a pristine tuxedo alongside Clara Montgomery. Under the headline, "The $12 billion heir, Julian Vance confirms summer wedding to tech heiress Clara Montgomery." Simi froze. Opening the folder, she found trust fund deeds, corporate share allocations, real estate portfolios worth hundreds of millions, and a draft of a prenuptial agreement. Her hands began to shake violently as the papers scattered across the floorboards. Suddenly, the anonymous woman in the town car, the $500,000 bribe, and every quiet night in the diner made terrible, agonizing sense. Julian walked through the front door carrying groceries and yellow lilies, greeting her warmly before stopping dead in his tracks. Simi was standing by the table, the magazine in her hand, tears streaming down her cheeks. The grocery bag slipped from Julian's grip, oranges rolling across the floor. He panicked, begging her to let him explain. Simi asked in profound agony what there was to explain. that his name wasn't just Julian, that he was a billionaire heir, or that while he was eating $3 toast with her, he was engaged to an heiress. She revealed that his mother had offered her $500,000 to leave him weeks ago. Julian's eyes widened in horror, asking what his mother had done. Simi sobbed that she had torn the check in half, thinking he was just a good guy with a bossy mum, only to find out he was sitting on $12 billion, letting his mother treat her like a beggar while lying to her face every single day. Julian pleaded that the engagement wasn't real and that his mother arranged it. He dropped to his knees, confessing that he hid the money because everyone in his life only wanted him for his wealth, and he was terrified she would look at him the same way if she knew the truth. Simi let out a heartbroken laugh, asking if he really thought she cared about his money. She told him she loved him because she thought he was honest, and that two people from different worlds could build something real. But he turned her life into a game he played when he got bored of his penthouse. Julian sobbed on the floor, grabbing the hem of her coat, begging her not to leave. Simi pulled her coat out of his grip, telling him never to call her again, to go back to his world and his mother, and to leave her alone. She slammed the door behind her. For the next 3 weeks, Simi attempted to drown her broken heart in work, taking every extra shift at Memorial Hospital, working 80-hour weeks on pure exhaustion while blocking Julian's calls and returning his flowers untouched. Her body broke down under the severe stress. On a rainy Thursday morning, while walking down the corridor of the pediatric ward, Simi felt a blinding pain flare behind her eyes. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor as a severe autoimmune encephalopathy flare flooded her nervous system. She was rushed into the ICU in critical condition, her brain swelling as her body slipped into systemic shock. Doctors placed her into a medically induced coma and attached her to a ventilator. When Julian received a frantic text from one of Simi's fellow residents, he abandoned a corporate meeting, shoved past his mother's protests, and drove through the rain to Memorial Hospital. In the weeks before her collapse, Simi had told her parents everything about the trust deeds and the magazine cover. Babatunde never forgot his face, so when Julian came sprinting down the ICU corridor shouting Simi's name, Babatunde knew exactly who he was looking at. When Julian burst into the ICU wing, Babatunde met him with full fury, slamming him against the wall in grief. Julian desperately offered a signed blank check to fly in world-class care, only for Babatunde to rip it to pieces and throw it in his face. Julian wept on his knees on the tile floor, confessing his fear and his deep love for Simi. Babatunde, seeing a man utterly broken by true love rather than an arrogant corporate predator, lowered his rage and told Julian to stand up, saying his daughter would hate seeing a man crawl. Shattered by guilt, Julian turned and walked down the hospital corridor, leaving his heart behind in that room. For 4 agonizing days, Simi remained in the coma. Julian refused to abandon her. He slept on a hard plastic chair in the hospital waiting room, 24 hours a day, using his wealth to fly in Dr. Aris Thorne, the world's leading neuroimmunologist from London, to oversee her care. On the second night, Simi's monitors spiked, forcing 6 doctors into the room, while Julian watched through the glass, alongside a praying Babatunde and a trembling Titilayo. She stabilized, and that terrifying scare opened a shared understanding that none of them could guarantee tomorrow. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. On the third night, Julian sat beside Simi's bed, reading aloud from her pediatric cardiology manual so she could hear a familiar voice. Babatunde walked in, carrying a warm container of jollof rice and fried plantains, gruffly telling Julian to eat before he fell into a coma himself. Julian looked up with hollow eyes, saying he didn't deserve their kindness. Babatunde replied plainly that he didn't, but shared a story from when Simi was 7 years old, how she brought home a bird with a broken wing and sat by its box for 6 days straight. He almost smiled, noting that Julian had learned to sit the exact same way. Julian looked at Simi, tears dripping onto his lap, declaring he would trade every dollar his family owned just to hear her laugh again. Babatunde reached across the bed, placing his hand over Julian's trembling fingers, softly telling him to eat his dinner. Outside in the hallway, Titilayo found Victoria Vance standing alone by the window, her polished composure cracking. Titilayo handed her a cup of chamomile tea, gently reminding her that power couldn't hold a person's hand when they were sick. Victoria looked through the glass at her son, tenderly wiping dust from Simi's forehead, realizing the fortress she had built for 30 years was actually a cage. A single tear escaped her eye, the first she had shed in decades. The next morning, Victoria called the board and personally withdrew Vance Global from the merger, absorbing the public financial hit alone to earn her son's forgiveness. Clara sent Julian a brief text saying thank you, and that she didn't know how to say no either, before leaving for Geneva to run her own climate tech fund. On the 5th morning, as golden dawn broke through the skyline, Simi's fingers twitched against Julian's hand. Simi opened her eyes, seeing her family praying and Victoria standing respectfully in the hallway. Gazing at Julian's messy hair and bloodshot eyes, she pulled off her oxygen mask and weakly whispered that he looked like a mess. Julian wept tears of pure relief, burying his face in her hands as he apologized. Simi quietly told him she had heard him reading to her and apologizing to her father through the coma. She added that while it didn't undo 7 months of lies, she was glad his voice was the last thing she remembered hearing before waking up. Over the next 6 weeks, Julian didn't push. He simply showed up with groceries and spent quiet evenings at her parents' kitchen table, letting Simi set the pace. 6 weeks later, Julian brought Simi back to the Maple Street diner, which he had rented out and decorated with fairy lights and yellow lilies. He placed an official document on the table, the deed to the Westside Community Health Center, revealing he had resigned from Vance Global and established an independent trust fund to fully finance her pediatric clinic for 50 years. Julian dropped to one knee on the diner floor, holding out a diamond ring, asking Simisola Adebayo for the honor of loving, protecting, and standing beside her for the rest of his life. Tears of pure joy spilled down Simi's cheeks as she threw her arms around his neck, answering yes 1,000 times over. Outside the window, Babatunde danced a joyful traditional Yoruba step alongside Titilayo, while Victoria laughed and captured the moment on her phone. As the Yoruba say, Iwalewa. Character is true beauty. If you were Simi, would you have torn up that check too? Or would you have taken the money and walked away? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next episode.